Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and well, it's been a hot minute. Unfortunately, I've been super busy and it's been hard to push out content, but we got something this week that is so in my ballpark and so interesting to me that I couldn't not make a video out of it, and that was the recent dev blog post that was pushed out by Riot where they go over their balance methodology, using specifically the example of the recent Sage nerfs to explain their process and sort of go over the criteria that they need to meet in order to move forward with changes to an agent. A lot of that is going to be fairly common sense stuff. Yes, they use competitive queue pick rate and win rates. I'm sure nobody's surprised by this. It's sort of a well done moment. But they also go through a little bit more of the minutia and even go so far as to make 4 bullets of questions that they ask themselves as they go through this to identify sort of the keystone elements that would indicate the need for an agent change. Something that went really under the radar in this post though, and something that is more my ballpark and something that is going to be the primary topic of this video, is a singular bullet towards the end of the post, where they bring up the fact that it's incredibly difficult to integrate competitive pro play statistics into the way that they balance the game. I'm going to highlight why that's so difficult, and at least in one particular case that will be highlighted throughout this video, why I think that in spite of that difficulty, they need to move fairly fast in addressing a certain corner of the meta at the moment. Let's jump right into it. To kick us off, here is one of the graphics that Riot used in that dev blog. This, obviously the non-mirror match win rates of agents on the particular patch that they were assessing, is the first step in identifying whether or not an agent is too powerful. When looking at simple competitive queue statistics, this is a fairly cut and dry scenario of, yes, Sage is very obviously overpowered, leading the field by almost a full 3%, and based just off of this information, you would think that moving forward with balance would be a fairly straightforward process. However, if you start trying to integrate pro play statistics, things get quite a bit more muddled. First, a quick disclaimer, I will be using the non-mirror round win rates from pro play, which is not an apples to apples comparison to the non-mirror match win rates, that is the statistics that Riot used for their competitive queue info in the dev post. The reason I'm using that round win rate is because there simply aren't enough matches in pro play to produce a high confidence match win rate statistic, and while it won't be a one-to-one comparison, the round win rate will absolutely be directionally correct and serve my needs in terms of making the points that I need to. With that disclaimer out of the way, you can immediately see what I'm getting at when I say that the pro play statistics confuse the equation a bit. If you were to look at these pro play statistics on their face, they're saying that Sage is not only not at the top of the food chain, but not even in the top half of the pack. This, however, is the result of something that the Rioters brought up in their dev blog, and that is selection bias when moving to the non-mirror subsections of this sort of data. You see, when something is so very blatantly overpowered, the overwhelming majority of the pro scene is going to see it as such. The ones who break from that mold and decide not to play the obviously overpowered element are only going to do so when they generally have a very clear game plan on how to counteract and beat it. In the case of Sage, where she was seeing well into the 90s play rates, this was very much so the case. Any teams that weren't running Sage were coming in with something like a raise and very distinct plans on how to counter Sage. But this is just scratching the surface in terms of the challenges that integrating pro play statistics into a balanced process can represent. Something definitely worth noting here before we move on is how egregiously above the rest of the agent's cipher is here, and this is preceding the Sentinel nerfs. And so while you have cases here where selection bias is camouflaging otherwise obviously overpowered agents, you also have a situation where the reverse is true. Cypher is very clearly overpowered in this dataset, and he would go on to receive a nerf just a few patches later. Before we move on to pick rates, touching on my personal case study here of the agent that I believe Riot needs to address in the immediate term, it is Sova. Over the past 3 patches in professional play, Sova has exhibited anything between a 54 and 57% non-mirror win rate. Not only was this mathematical red flag consistent across all regions and all levels of play, be it C tier, B tier, or A tier, it was on grand display throughout First Strike, where in the 43,000 rounds of global First Strike gameplay I had in my dataset, Sova exhibited a flat 54% win rate, head and shoulders above the rest of the pack. Moving on to pick rate, this is again the graph that Riot used in their dev blog post. If we shift that down and par it against the case study that I'm bringing forward here of Sova, we see that it's not going to be a perfect comparison. Sova is currently boasting, in my First Strike data, only a 73.4% pick rate. The plot twist here, however, is that he has a far more map-specific bias than Sage ever had. If we remove Split, Sova's least played map traditionally, as well as Icebox, a map that was too new to have any sort of confident results behind it, we get this. A scenario where Sova is over 90% pick rate. And for those curious, if I stratify my data to look at the pro play statistics of Sage during the time period that Riot's data is from, she was played 90.9% of the time, almost precisely the same bracket where Sova currently is on his primary maps. This begs a number of questions, be it whether or not overprominence on specific maps is an acceptable state of being, as well as a slew of other things, but it is absolutely a point of intrigue in my eyes. With the stats out of the way, this was the phase at which Riot assumed that an agent was overpowered based off of statistical evidence. However, as in all things, a simple statistic and a single dimension will never be enough to prove a point, so they went on to outline 4 other characteristics that they used throughout their analysis process. The first of which was direct feedback from you, i.e. players, the community, content creators, etc., on why you believe, insert agent name here, is strong, both in surveys and in direct conversations. In an attempt to get the ball rolling, this is me trying to give direct feedback on why I believe Sova is strong. And while I certainly can't be a survey of one, this will be a direct conversation of me to anyone that is listening to this video, and down in the comments below, I would love to see if we couldn't get a form of survey going ourselves. What do you all think of Sova? What do you think of his current balance state and his place in the metagame? And so now on to my own feedback. I think that Sova as an agent is incredibly dangerous to have in any TAC FPS. This isn't me trying to make a case to delete him, that would be absolutely asinine, but it is me making a case that the level of information he can currently obtain at the level of risk he can obtain it is not healthy, nor would it ever be healthy for this game's meta. You have pre-existing precedent in games like Rainbow Six Siege, where information at too little risk and too little cost warped entire seasons worth of metagame into an intel meta. That is something that is actively threatening Valorant, and frankly, if we look at First Strike, has already arrived in many regions. You have a situation where Cypher, Omen, Sova cores are the go-to because of the amount of information and space denial that they can get on a whim. If we look at Sova's kit in particular, you have 3 recon darts that will get functional value in a round, assuming that you're managing cooldowns correctly. Those recon darts in solo queue are fairly omnipotent. The likelihood that your average gold player is going to have a pre-fired lineup for a Sova dart is almost none. But at the same time, information is also something that isn't capitalized as effectively on uncoordinated pug teams as they are in pro play. If we look at the professional level of play, you will have instances where a high caliber team will preset someone and assign them to shooting arrows. However, on the flip side of that, you have progressively stronger Sovas, like Hiko in North America, who has such a broad suite of arrows that the likelihood you will be able to choose which exact recon location he is firing to gets increasingly low and will just get more low as time goes on. If we look at the other part of his kit, and frankly the one that I am more concerned about in aggregate, is the Owl Drone. Owl Drone is such a powerful ability at its core that there has now reached a point in the North American metagame in particular where entire teams' success hinges on their ability to acquire free space off of an Owl Drone walk-up. This obviously isn't universally the case, but you genuinely have teams that are competing at levels that they have only risen to because they have used Aldrones to band-aid fundamental failures in the way that they play the game. In talking to coaches, analysts, and pro players from multiple regions, I have heard Aldrones described as wonderful things including band-aids, crutches, and training wheels. The issue lies in the fact that Aldrone has no counterplay. You may argue that the ability to shoot it represents counterplay, but that is, to put it bluntly, a red herring. Shooting an Aldrone is wholly meaningless when the way that the overwhelming majority of teams are currently utilizing it is as a pseudo-entry and there is a gun immediately following it. Even if that weren't the case, the ease of wallbanging in this game means that an Aldrone dart in most scenarios is an instant death. Even in instances where you have a character that could say molly under the Aldrone and then shoot it out, they're likely going to be tagged and punished and forced off of their space. The only counterplay, if you really want to call it that exists for Aldrones, is preemptively falling off your angle and choosing to concede that space. In a game that is so heavily reliant on map control, that is not an acceptable state of being for an ability. Alright. With my feedback out of the way, we drop down to the second bullet, which is breaking out the agent's strengths by side. This is something that I can absolutely do, and we'll move right into it. Sova's sided win rates throughout First Strike was 54.9% on attack and 53.1% on defense. This is largely going to be, at least in my assessment, a direct reflection of the state of being that I was just describing. His ability to acquire free space for attackers with Aldrones is far stronger than is acceptable. And while it definitely is more pronounced on the attacker's side of the map, due to its power in things like retaking, it is still significantly above average on defense. Now, moving on to the third bullet, breaking out the agent's strength and presence by rank. This one is a little bit difficult to tackle. I do not have competitive Q statistics as the Riot developers do, and so the closest analog I can provide is comparing my pro play statistics versus the live statistics that they actually used at the end of their dev blog to show Sage's state more recently after the nerfs. In those statistics that they displayed, the comp Q pick rate of Sova was at 42%, and the comp Q match win rate of Sova was at 49.3%. If we compare that to professional play, we see why applying these pro play statistics to balance is absolute nightmare fuel. He is vastly underperforming in competitive Q, both in pick rate and in match win, but when we look at his professional play presence, he is overwhelmingly dominant. Landing on this fourth bullet, it is the one element of this that I will not be able to provide information on. Unfortunately, I don't have a way of automatically collecting this kind of data from pro play, and manually collecting it would take 30 of me. So as it stands, I unfortunately cannot close the loop on this final bullet. That said, however, I wanted to jump back to that third bullet to elaborate a little bit more on dissecting an agent's power and presence by the level of play it is being seen in, whether that be the professional play statistics that I add to this, or the competitive Q statistics that Riot showed in their dev blog. Specifically, I want to talk about how this represents a very significant challenge, and it's unfortunately one that Riot has quite a track record with. Over the last decade or so, I have been an avid League of Legends player, both competitively and reaching high levels of solo queue, and it is a perfect place to go to find other examples of this discrepancy between professional play success and casual play success that Riot refers to as the mastery curve. You see, the mastery curve at a most basic level is the relationship between a player's ability to succeed on a character versus the amount of expertise they have on that character. Is it something with an incredibly low hurdle of execution, and so the mastery curve doesn't increase significantly, or is it something that has a lot of nuance to it that requires hundreds of games to coax out all of its potential? In League, you have characters like Azir and Akali who are famous for their mastery curves and their gross discrepancy between their pro play success and their solo queue successes. They both have track records of repeated nerfs and buffs trying to strike the balance between making something viable in solo queue while simultaneously not egregiously overpowered in the hands of a high tier player. Unfortunately, I think that Sova may very well be Valorant's first character that falls into this archetype. I think it will be difficult, if not wholly impossible, to get him to a state where he is viable and strong in solo queue while not astronomically overpowered in pro play. And that will bring us to the outro, where I wanted to cover a topic that may or may not be obvious at this point, and it's something that I think every agent, character, champion, operator-based game has had to come to terms with at one point or another, and that is, will you balance for pro play or will you balance for casual play? I think that at a certain point, and this may be the pessimist in me, trying to think that you can do both is a fool's errand and wishful thinking. I think that Riot is coming up to a point in time where they're going to have to choose between, do we make Sova an agent that has a 20% pick rate in solo queue because nobody wants to pull him out, or do we allow him to potentially create such a skewed metagame in our professional ecosystem that we start falling into patterns like the Intel metas in Rainbow Six, or heaven forbid, the GOATS meta in Overwatch that ultimately many people blame for killing the esports' viewership as a whole. What happens if in 3 to 4 months the Valorant metagame is still people aldroning their team up X portion of Y map, and that is the entirety of the level of strategic depth that we see out of a lot of squads? That's not something that I believe anybody wants to see, but it's something that is already manifesting in multiple regions in very, very high levels of incidence. And that'll wrap us up. Definitely not a particularly bright tenor of video for the holiday season, but it's a topic that, with the dev blog that came out from Riot, I couldn't resist doing. I've had this opinion of Sova for a while now, and getting very transparent insight into their process when it came to the way that they dissect statistics when looking at balance changes, it fell perfectly in line with a way where I could methodically show my thought processes behind why I believe Sova is in such a dangerous position in the meta, while also giving you guys a little bit more insight into why I believe Riot, and frankly any game developer, would struggle to integrate pro play statistics into the way that they address their game. Do you make changes for the minority in order to create a healthy professional ecosystem, or do you basically chalk up entire subsections of your game as losses to the general public because they're too abusable by high-level players? It's a challenge that I don't think there's ever going to be a black or white answer for. Obviously, I'm always going to have a bias for the professional play balance side of that coin, just due to the type of person that I am and the level of involvement I have in the space, but it is an incredible challenge that I will never envy in the remotest sense. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts down below. What do you think about this situation I'm describing with Sova? I don't think that it is really a question of whether or not he's overpowered. I think that at this point, if we look over the last 4 patches, there is inarguable statistical evidence that he is a major, major issue. It is a question of whether or not him being a major issue in pro play warrants changes on a universal scale, and whether or not there are levers that can be pulled in his balance toolkit that would affect him only at high levels of play. Really curious to hear your guys' thoughts on this one. Obviously, it's something that I'm fairly passionate about, as with every video that I put up, but love your guys' feedback as always. I really appreciate those of you who are watching this video. Obviously, I had that hiatus where I've been away for quite a while. Hopefully that dissipates significantly and I get more consistent content out to you, but unfortunately, no promises on that one. Thanks as always for sticking around. Really appreciate you guys sticking it out with me, watching my content. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.